Yeah, what do you mean, better looking? What are you saying? That's a reverse compliment.
After we interviewed you, we came up with 3 specific questions that we would like you to rephrase, and I'll ask each one individually and give you time to answer. The first one, you mentioned that Bob is very gracious. Could you tell me about the lunch you were at with Bob and W.C. Arnold?
Well, history is always written by the victors in any political or social event. And in the case of statehood, the history that you read about is the history of Bob Atwood putting forth a prodigious effort along with a number of other people in having Alaska become a state. But there's one individual who kind of got lost in the shuffle over the years, a man named W.C. Arnold, who was the lobbyist for the seafood industry out of Seattle. And he was the man who fought statehood. Ernest Greening once said that W.C. Arnold single-handedly prevented statehood for 16 years. And he was a very effective opponent to statehood. In 1985, I brought W.C. Arnold to a Rotary luncheon. At that time, Mr. Arnold was 82 years old and suffering from Parkinson's disease, so he was having some physical difficulty in getting to the meeting, although his mind was still very sharp. And we sat at the table across from Bob Atwood. And after we sat down, Mr. Atwood reached across the table, shook hands with Mr. Arnold, and he said, "Bill, I've always wanted to tell you that throughout the battle for statehood, we only wished that we had had a W.C. Arnold on our side of the battle." And I thought that was an extremely gracious statement to make to a man who was incredibly powerful back in the 40s and the 50s, but, as I say, because of history and because of the way things turned out, is not known by very many people today. And Bob Atwood was the one who was sensitive enough to make that comment and compliment a man who truly deserved the compliment.
Okay, the second one was the battle for statehood was long and hard. How did Bob treat the leaders of the opposition?
Bob was always an extremely gracious gentleman. Mr. Arnold always told me that he knew exactly what Bob Atwood was going to be doing. Bob Atwood would actually call him on the telephone and say, "Here's our strategy, here's what we plan to do." And he always took a high road in all of his battles for statehood. They never engaged in any kind of misrepresentations or any kinds of Machiavellian machinations behind the scenes. It was always very straightforward, very honorable. And I believe that's the way he's always led his life.
Okay. Now, you told us a story about Bob and W.C. Arnold, and where Bob told W.C. only that his only regret was that they didn't have a W.C. Arnold on their side. Could you elaborate on this?
Do you mean elaborate on the statehood question, or elaborate on?
What we're trying to get is the story itself, and basically it's a repeat of the first question.
Okay.
Trying to take you off guard and maybe get you to tell it in a different way.
Okay. Well, I brought it caught me off guard, but I brought W.C. Arnold to a Rotary luncheon meeting in about 1985, and Mr. Arnold had not been to the Rotary meeting for quite a few years. And many of the Rotarians didn't even know who this elderly gentleman was any longer. The older Rotarians, including Bob Atwood, knew that he was a very, very prominent opponent to statehood, the lobbyist for the seafood industry in Alaska and Washington, and a man whom Ernest Greening had characterized as single-handedly preventing statehood for 16 years. Bob Atwood shook hands with Mr. Arnold, and we sat down and we chatted a little bit, generally conversation, and pretty soon Bob reached across the table with his fork or with his knife, and he said, "Bill, I want you to know that our only regret during the battle for statehood was that we didn't have a W.C. Arnold on our side of the battle." And my thought at the time was that was an extremely kind, generous thing for Bob Atwood to say to a man who was extremely prominent at the time, but who has been lost in these historical events because he was representing the side that didn't win ultimately.
Okay. So there were 3 years prepared.
Okay.
Or if you, I don't know if you think I've missed something. I know I wasn't in interviews with Richard. Most everything else I pulled out. He gave me a lot of great information.
Yeah.
Maybe so we don't have anyone like Ed or Jim confirmed for sure. Maybe we should ask Bob about the Boy Scout troop.
There's a, okay.
Fred Lacoste did tell us that it wasn't Anchorage.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of the background of the situation first. In the 1950s, we had a Republican administration in Washington, D.C., and our delegates to Congress, the Alaskan delegates, Bob Bartlett and Ernest Greening, were both Democrats, which meant that they really did not have an active voice into the White House for purposes of promoting statehood. Bob Atwood, on the other hand, was a Republican and had supported Eisenhower for president. When he visited Washington, D.C., one of the executives from, I believe it was Scripps Howard syndication, worked out an appointment for him to meet President Eisenhower. And he went to the White House on the appointed date, and Jim Haggerty, the press secretary, briefed him before he went into the Oval Office to visit the president. Haggerty told him, "You are not allowed to talk politics. You are going in there to give your greetings and pay your respects to the President of the United States. This is not a political trip, even though we know you're here to fight for statehood for Alaska." Bob was extremely disappointed that here he had an audience with the president, and he was not allowed to talk politics. And what I always thought was extremely admirable was that he intended to abide by that declaration by Jim Haggerty. He went to the Oval Office. He sat down with the president. They discussed old friends they knew in Alaska. They discussed the president's trips to Alaska during World War II and parties they had attended together. And Bob never said a word about statehood. But President Eisenhower said to him, "Bob, what do you think of this issue of statehood for Alaska?" And Bob was off and running. And one of the extremely important things that he pointed out to the president was that the president's policy in the United Nations opposing colonialism for all of the Western European nations was going to suffer if Alaska and Hawaii continued virtually as colonies of the United States. And he felt that the president really was impressed by that argument and that it had some bearing on the president's eventual support of statehood for Alaska. But the important point here is that Bob was told that the rules were, when you go to the Oval Office, you are not to be talking politics. You're to be paying your respects to the president. And until the president gave him the opportunity, this man intended to follow the rules.
In your research, could you please tell us about Bob Atwood and Troop 618?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, we have to put things in perspective here. We think of Bob Atwood as a venerable elder of our community. In 1941, Bob Atwood was one of the young men barely getting started in his business. So when the Rotary Club organized, they held a meeting at the Anchorage Hotel, and the venerable elders of that time, people like Bob Burgaw and Zach Lusak, they got the few chairs that were there in that little room off the lobby, and Bob Atwood and Doc Hines and a few others had to sit on the floor. So we had a young businessman here, a young journalist and editor of a newspaper, who sat on the floor in the Anchorage Hotel in January 1941, helped organize a major community service organization for Anchorage, and then immediately began participating in undertaking one of the first projects, which was organizing a Boy Scout troop, Troop 618. By October of 1941, that troop was up and running. A man named McVicker was the troop leader, and a man named Hanselmeyer, who came from Fort Richardson, was the assistant troop leader at the time. The following spring in 1942, Bob and a number of other Rotarians donated building materials so that these young boys could build themselves the first permanent Boy Scout camp out at Lake Spenard. Now, Lake Spenard at that time was down an old dirt road out through a lot of moose hunting territory. It wasn't anywhere near the city of Anchorage, so they had to go quite a ways out to get there. There was also a camp out at Sand Lake, which was even further out, and that was a 2-day trip. They left on a Friday, and they didn't come back in until Sunday. And Bob Atwood was one of the Rotarians during 1942 who went along with these young Boy Scouts in Troop 618. And I think the major thing that Bob was the leader in doing for the Boy Scouts was in 1945 when he was the president of the Rotary Club himself. One of their major projects that year was acquiring a Quonset hut down in Seward, convincing the Alaska Railroad that they should move the Quonset hut to Alaska or to Anchorage free of charge, convincing a local contractor that he should move it from the railroad yard up to a lot on the corner of 9th and 8th Street, and then having the local contractors and businessmen get together with the Boy Scouts, with Troop 618, and wire this Quonset hut, put in an oil heater, insulate it. They built tables. They brought old chairs and sofas that they had from homes and things that they found out in backyards, and made the first meeting hall for Troop 618 on the corner of 9th and 8th Street. Before that, they had been meeting at the American Legion Hall, and by 1945, it was actually 2 units of that troop, and it was just too large a troop to meet at the American Legion Hall any longer. That was all done under Bob's leadership.
Repeat all that, you'll just remember it.
Yeah. Okay. The Rotary Club began in January of 1945 under the leadership of Bob Atwood and a number of other local businessmen. By October of 1941, they had already organized their Boy Scout troop, Troop 618. In May of 1942, the Rotarians assisted the Boy Scouts in building their first permanent camping facility at Lake Spenard, which at that time was quite a ways out of Anchorage through a lot of good moose hunting country. That same year, the Rotarians, including Bob Atwood, took the Boy Scouts out on a 3-day camping trip to Sand Lake, and that was even quite a bit further out from the city of Anchorage. Then in 1945, when Bob Atwood was the president of the Rotary Club, he organized a group of Rotarians who purchased a Quonset hut and had the Quonset hut constructed on the corner of 9th and 8th Street in Anchorage as the first permanent meeting location for Troop 618, which by that time was so large that it had divided into 2 units and had outgrown its meeting space at the American Legion Hall.
That was good. I think just if, for one last.
Okay, you had mentioned that Bob is very gracious. Could you tell me about the lunch you were at with Bob and W.C. Arnold?
Well, first you have to understand that history is written by the victors, and many times very important people who were prominent in their time are kind of lost in history. And one such person, in my opinion, is W.C. Arnold, whom Governor Greening characterized as a man who single-handedly prevented statehood for 16 years. He was a hired lobbyist for the fish industry, and he did a very effective job. And he was on the other side of all these issues with Bob Atwood and others who were fighting for statehood. In 1985 or 1984, I brought W.C. Arnold to a Rotary luncheon here in Anchorage. And by this time, Mr. Arnold, at 82 years old, was suffering from Parkinson's disease, so he was having some physical difficulty getting around, although his mind was still very alert. We sat at the table, and Bob Atwood reached across and shook hands with him, and they chatted pleasantries for a little while. And pretty soon Bob Atwood kind of reached his finger or his fork across, and he said, "Bill, I want you to know that the only difficulty that we had with statehood was the fact that we didn't have a W.C. Arnold fighting on our side of the issue." And at the time I thought that was extremely generous, extremely magnanimous of this man to tell W.C. Arnold how good he really had been in preventing statehood for a number of years.
Okay. Great.
Try that focus for lunch there, buddy.
What? Okay.
Can you look at the
Look
frame? I might like more of her head.
You want a little more?
Yeah.
A little wider?
What do you think, John? I think I like this, that, better.
Okay.
No problem. Gloria, in our earlier interview, you talked about that Bob Atwood is old-fashioned. Could you tell us how he
I
is?
think we ought to wait for this. I think
Right.
we're okay now.
Gloria, earlier when we were talking, you told us that Bob is old-fashioned. Could you give us some examples about this?
Well, I guess that sort of dates me, because Bob is what I consider a gentleman of the old school. He believes in the old-fashioned virtues. In fact, what Bob believes is a great deal what the Boy Scout pledge is. So I would imagine that Boy Scouts could do worse than to use Bob Atwood as a role model. He's very chivalrous to women, which I enjoy. And in all the almost 40 years I've known him, I've never heard him tell an off-color, embarrassing story that would embarrass women. And I like that, because I think it's disappearing from the earth. And I'm not sure the earth is better for it.
You also described we also talked about him being a gentleman. Could you describe some of his gentlemanly qualities?
Well, he's kind and gentle. He has a great sense of humor. I used to call him my partner in rhyme. And one time at a party, he and I wrote a poem that he sang to the tune of Bill Grogan's Goat. He would write 2 lines, and then I would write 2 lines. But it was always kind. It was never hurtful. And I guess that's what I mean when I say he's a kind man. Bob, I can't imagine, would deliberately hurt anyone.
Just briefly, Tricia's asked you a question and you say, well, he, if you could just say he or Bob.
Okay. Okay.
Where do we go from here now? Did you pick up the 2 questions? Well, she sort of talked about
Yeah.
Fashion might not be the right word. That was a word that you felt he
Well, I could just say he incorporates, but then I get into the virtues, and the virtues have to do with the pledge, and we're one step ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Let me think. How is Bob old-fashioned? I'm the one that does not sing. The other's a singer.
We're rolling. So you just want her full name? Yeah. You just said your name.
Gloria McCutcheon.
Gloria, could you please tell us, how is Bob old-fashioned?
Well, I think he had a old-fashioned upbringing. He speaks often of his mother and his brothers and how they lived in, I believe it was Illinois, and I think that's where he learned much of his courtly manners that all of us appreciate.
You mentioned that Bob is a chivalrous man. What would be an example of this?
Well, in all the 40 years I've known him, he's never told an off-color, embarrassing story that embarrasses the ladies. He's never sworn around ladies, and I am getting to the point where I find that wonderful. I think it's something that's disappearing from the earth from what I overhear, and I don't think the earth's going to be better for it.
Could you describe Bob's gentlemanly qualities?
Well, again, his treatment of women. He's very, very kind to women. One time, he and I wrote a verse that he put to the tune of Bill Grogan's Goat and sang it about people at the party. And it came as a surprise, but he was very careful not to be hurtful in that. It was funny without being hurtful. Another example of his wit is he just recently served his guests meat pies after having taken them to Sweeney Todd. Now, I think that shows a delicious sense of humor without being hurtful, just being clever.
Bob is well loved by all of his friends, and people seem to have a lot of respect for the way he treats other people. He just seems to embody being very courteous and respectful to everybody. Could you speak about that and start by saying maybe Bob is or Bob has been special to you?
I think Bob is special to a lot of people. I can't think of over the years anyone that Bob has ever deliberately hurt. He's very, very kind. Children adore him. I know my daughter is crazy about him, and so is my granddaughter. So he seems to cross the generations with great alacrity. And his own grandchildren, and particularly little girls just really think Bob Atwood is a neat person.
Would you say that's because of the way he treats them with his mannerisms, and he's polite and courteous to them, or is
And shows, Bob shows interest in children, and he lets them talk. You know, he asks them questions and draws them out. That may be the reporter in him, but he gives them, as I say, particularly little girls. I haven't seen him with boys. I've seen him with his grown grandson, and they have a great relationship. They fish together, and they have a wonderful time. But particularly little girls are just really crazy about Bob Atwood.
Why do you like Bob Atwood?
I like Bob Atwood because he is my good friend, but also both he and Evangeline did so much for Alaska that Alaska will probably never be able to repay. I just came back from a sort of a constitutional convention revisited in Juneau, and any number of those delegates who now, the oldest one is 100, give credit to Bob Atwood and his ability to write and what he wrote in the Anchorage Times that got Alaska statehood. So I guess to answer your question, I like him because he's always been a very good friend of mine and a kind, gentle man. But also, and this was important to he and Evangeline, and as years go by, I realize it's so important to me for what he has done for Alaska, what they both did for Alaska.
A lot of people will say some of the best times have been around the Atwood dinner table, and that they were very good hosts.
Evangeline entertained before there were hotels here, and if someone came to town and we needed to put our best foot forward, Evangeline would invite them out to the log house that went down the hill in the earthquake, incidentally, and show them that we did indeed wear shoes, we did know how to behave properly, and that if they should give us statehood, we thought we knew what we could do with it.
We're just trying to get you comfortable.
Okay.
The one thing I'd like to go back to, and I haven't quite heard it the way I want it to
Okay.
is the way this script is written right now, and I can
Okay.
change this. But right prior to what you say, I have a speaker saying courteous, respectful, sociable. Bob is truly a gentleman. Maybe if we could think of a specific incident that you can recall, maybe where Bob has been a gentleman. And I think with the children, it's almost there because he's a gentle man and also very considerate of them, but it didn't quite come across the courteous.
You'll have to let me think a minute then. Courteous. He is just, I don't know if you've met him, but he is just so innately I'm off the record now, am I not? He is so innately courteous that it's like, it's really difficult to think of one specific example. You know, when it's just so basic to his thing that it's hard. Now, I'm trying to work with you, and I'm trying to think of something that would show, because it's just, you know, he always has been.
Maybe it's just a universal statement about
It is with him, yeah. He is, he's, as I say, a gentleman for the old school. He's, as near as I can see, it's kind of an endangered species. Isn't that funny that I can't, because he is so genuinely, and you can't imagine, I can't imagine, even after the earthquake and their house went down in it, you know, that would be enough to, you know, make anyone better, but I never, ever heard him, as I say, I've never heard him swear. It's funny, I can't think, I'm flunking this course because I can't think of one specific. If you'd say to try to figure out one time when he wasn't courteous, I couldn't do that either. He is just so genuine, you know, I'm afraid this is not working in with your format.
Well, no, I think.
Do you think you got enough? Because all the things that the Boy Scout is, that's what he is. And see, he was almost raised like something out of, who is the painter that paints American, Norman Rockwell. That was a kind of a background that he had. And that mother, he is really a tribute to that mother. That mother got all these qualities across to them, and I have met two of his brothers, and they all seem to have it. So I guess they're a tribute to his upbringing. Isn't that awful? I can't think of what. Well, I don't know. If you have a friend that has that you could describe in one word, and you say try and it just describes him so completely that it's hard to pick out a thing that would be an example of his courteousness, except as what I've said is his treatment of women. Because I've been in this country a long time, and I tell you, a lot of these Alaskan men, you have to really roll with the punches on some of the things. And of course, the children's language now that you just overhear just almost shocks me to death. But yeah, but you never hear anything like that of Bob Atwood. I don't know if maybe you haven't got a good subject to him because he is everything a Boy Scout should be. And that's what I worry about on this, is that maybe he'll come across as, you know, but he has a terrific sense of humor, and I'm sure that that's going to come across.
Maybe a universal statement, comparing Bob's gentlemanly qualities or his courteous nature to all the men you've ever met in Alaska. Even, you know, it's like Bob is by far the most courteous and gentle man I have ever met in my 40 years as a human.
Okay, I'll say that. Bob is by far the most courteous and gentle man I've met in my 40-some years in Alaska, and that includes my beloved, Steve McCutcheon.
That one was really good. Do you think that would be, I think that will fit in with my script. That was a good take, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, he and Steve are good friends, and they're just about the same age. And, you know, I'm always saying to Steve, Steve, you know, you should be saying those things to Bob Atwood. Steve is the more typical, I think, old Alaskan man, where I've modified him some. I'd like to think I've modified Steve a lot.
So,
Yeah.
how much we can get for what we got?
We won't do
Can't. Oh, I see. For what? Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, I'm real happy with that last take. I think that you said some things earlier in my studies, but that last one I know.
You like it? Well, it might please tickle a lot of the people there who know them both, and they will immediately know the contrast between Bob and Steve. They're very good friends. They worked on statehood, you know, for years. Steve was in the territorial stuff and Bob in the paper, and Bob was down there, Juneau, as a delegate, and they worked together. So it might go over with this particular audience. You know, I hope all this isn't being recorded for posterity, but some people were telling me of that old gang that they hadn't received invitations to this. Do you think I should call anyone?
Oh, my name is Lorene Harrison.
Wait, just to spell your name right, we've gone back and forth. It's Lorene?
Correct.
Okay. And
Please
J-R-R
emphasize that. I get Lorraine so many times, and I don't like that.
And Harrison is Harrison.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Lorene, earlier, we understand that you were Bob's choir teacher. Is he really a good singer?
Well, I wouldn't say I was his teacher. I directed the First Presbyterian Church choir for 30 years, and he sang in the choir. But I have to tell you how he came into the choir. Now, I came in 1928, and there was just a population of about 2,500 people in Anchorage. So I think they came in 1935. I'm guessing at that. But there were perhaps 3,000 people in Anchorage at that time, so it was a very small population. And they were Presbyterians, and so I suspect that they came to church the first Sunday, and probably we met. Bob volunteered to sing in the choir. Of course, the little church was a very small church, I suppose, capacity of perhaps 100 people, not more than that, I'm sure. And Evangeline offered to play the piano. I had been playing the piano for the church and sort of directing as I played. There were, I suppose, maybe 10, 12 people in the choir at that time. And the audience sometimes was not a whole lot larger than that. Well, so Bob offered to sing in the choir, and Evangeline played. So that meant that I could get up in front of the choir and wave my arms around. Well, Bob, one Sunday, I have to tell you about this certain circumstance. One Sunday, he was the only tenor that came. And we were doing a number that had a very short little tenor solo in it. And Bob said, well, I'm not going to sing that by myself. So you can see that he knew he was not a soloist. So I said, well, the altos will sing it with you. So I said to the altos, I suppose there were 3 altos there, and I said, you girls sing that along with Bob. When it came time for the solo, not a woman opened their mouth. So he sang it as a solo. After the church was over, now this was some years later, he said, well, you know, I feel like I have really reached the top. I have been a soloist. I have sung. It's the apex of my musical career, and so there's nothing left to go forward to, so I guess I might just as well quit. So that was the end of his church singing. It wasn't really, but that was what he had to say. Bob always had a great sense of humor, and there were times when we needed a sense of humor sometimes when everybody didn't show up. You know, a small group, when one person misses, they are really missed. But anyway, in those early years, in the late 30s and the early 40s, as I say, there were not many people, and so when you have the ability to do something and you're called on to do it, you do it. Well, the Elks Club was the big social event. Everybody went dancing at the Elks Club on Saturday night, dressed up, long dresses. It was great fun. And they often wanted some special entertainment, so they would ask me if I wouldn't get something. So we had a male quartet, and Bob was singing in that male quartet. And he was probably the most punctual and the one that nobody enjoyed it more than Bob did. And Evangeline was outside one winter, the winter that Elaine was born. And I was looking in my diary the other day. I used to keep a diary in those days. And I noticed that Bob was at our house for dinner once or twice a week, and I think those must have been the times when we had rehearsals afterwards for the quartet, the male quartet, to sing something that they would sing at the Elks Club. And then there was a women's glee club. They asked me if I would direct that. That was, I think, in about 1939. And the men saw how much fun the women were having. We put on programs. The only place to give programs in those days was the old Empress Theater. And when we would give a program during the week sometime because it was less expensive. The manager would charge us just for what there would have been the paying people for the movie that night. So, of course, the middle of the week was a less expensive time for us, so we would have a program about that time. And then the men decided that they would like to have a group. So we called it the Men's Glee Club. And Bob was very active in that. He was always willing. He didn't have the greatest, the greatest solo voice, let's just put it that way. But he was certainly willing to help out, and he was great. His attitude was always just super.
Okay, our next question is, now, do you want me to mention it? What's with the trumpet? The trumpet player?
Well, yeah, he was playing
He was playing it during the earthquake.
during the earthquake.
The earthquake comes later in the script, so more
From, can we redo any of these up here?
why don't we do this one and see what we get?
No, you're not starting at the beginning again.
Yeah.
No.
What we might do when she asks her is ask you the same question again, just to see if you answered a little bit different, maybe a little bit more, a
With-
tighter answer.
With Bob instead of E.
Exactly.
Okay.
We understand that Bob has always been a very enthusiastic musician. Could you tell us about his legendary talent?
Bob's talent was as much enthusiasm as it was music, and he was always available when you called him. The Elks Club was one of the places in the early days that was very significant as far as entertainment was concerned, and frequently they asked me if I would get some entertainment for a part of the evening. So usually Bob would be the first person that I would call, and he would say, well, what do you want? Are you going to have quartet? Are you going to have a glee club? Or what are we going to have? I remember one time we got big sombreros for a male quartet, and they entertained during the intermission at the dance when the dance band took a little rest. And I think we had about 4 songs that the quartet sang. And Bob was usually the baritone in this, and I can't even remember the names of the other. We had various people, but Bob, of course, was consistent. He was always one of them. And then, of course, when the choir sang, why, he was there ready to participate, except the one time when he sang the solo and decided he didn't need to do any more solos.
That was perfect, and a truck, I don't know if you heard it start its engine out here, so we think it might have picked up. So what I'd like to do is just have Tricia ask you the same thing.
Oh, dear.
And you don't have to answer it the exact same way, but I think what you said in that answer was what we're looking for.
The same thing, because she's
Mhm.
going.
Yeah, right.
We understand that Bob was a very enthusiastic musician. Could you tell us about his legendary talent?
Well, I would have to say that Bob's enthusiasm was as important as his musicianship. I would call usually Bob if we were going to have a quartet or if we were going to get the glee club together, and he would say, well, do you want me to call somebody? So he was very cooperative in all the things that we were doing. He would say, who are you going to have for the bass this time? You're going to call Bill Kinsel. He was with the Alaska Railroad. And he would say, well, I'll call Bill for you. And that was always Bob's big thing, was that he was willing to cooperate and help in any way that he could. He loved music, and he liked good music. But he also had a sense of humor, and it was always fun when he would do a little caper or two, you know, when we were having a quartet.
I think that was it. Why don't we just one one more, just so that
Okay.
I have one more on the tape. Why don't you ask her this question again?
Okay.
And then I think we'll be done.
How would you describe Bob's love for music?
Bob had a great love for music. He had quite a musical education, along with his newspaper work, and so he was qualified to be aware of good music. When we started the concert association, for instance, he was thrilled with the pianist that we had. Our first pianist was Grant Johannesson, and he said, we've got to have more of that. So he was very enthusiastic about the good things that we had in this little town, and that meant, I don't think that there were 3,000 people in this town when he and Evangeline moved in. And, you know, that's not very many people, and so you don't have many people to call on when you're talking about getting something organized in the musical way. He was always cooperative. There was no question ever about his lack of cooperation. I can't ever remember calling on him and his saying no.
You would please state your name.
I am Gloria Marinacci Allen, Allen.
And then if you will just sort of take my question and rephrase it into your answer. The Atwoods are well known for their generous contributions. What can you tell me about their motivation for giving?
The Atwood name is certainly synonymous with generosity to the arts in this community. I would say there are a number of organizations, arts organizations, the Opera, Alaska Light Opera Theater, the Alaska Music Festival, would not be in business today if I've got to change that. Got the wrong name. I wasn't going to say names. Can we start again? I'm sorry. It's not the Alaska Festival of Music anymore. It's the Anchorage Music Festival. So I better not say that because I'm not sure about it.
Concert Association.
And the Concert Association. Well, she started. Did you start it or did Evangeline?
Oh, no, I started it.
But they contributed heavily, didn't they?
Well, they
Too.
have always
Yeah.
contributed.
Yeah. Well, I won't name names.
I'll rephrase. I'll start
Okay.
the question. The Atwoods are well known for their generous contributions. What can you tell me about their motivation for giving?
The Atwood name is certainly synonymous with generosity to the arts in this community. There are a number of organizations that would not be in existence today, arts organizations, had it not been for the generosity of the Atwood family. Bob, I think, believes, as Evangeline did, that the arts are not just a bit of fluff, but something that is very, very important to all people, to nourish the soul. The music that Bob enjoys so much, he feels should be available to everyone. And therefore he does in every way that he can. He makes this possible, not only by giving money, but by giving his time and going out and raising money and participating and seeing to it that the quality of life in our community is better, much better for all people.
Bob is known for his generous spirit. Could you give me some examples?
Bob, last fall, was asked to participate in a Chamber of Commerce show, the Gold Pan Awards. Bob is a very busy man. Even though he is retired, he's writing, he's lecturing, and yet he took time, scheduled time, to attend every rehearsal for this wonderful event. He practiced diligently. He learned his words. He also practiced his trumpet because he knew he was going to be asked to play the trumpet as well. And I would say the hit of the evening was Bob and Bill Tobin singing a duet from the Elvis Presley era, Love Me Tender. It was a joy to hear Bob and Bill sing this duet because you knew how much time and effort had gone into it, and that's the kind of person he is. Once he commits to doing something, he gives himself over totally.
What can you tell me about Bob's appreciation for the arts?
Bob Atwood, I'm sure, was born in a family of musicians, or certainly music lovers. He had to have had music in his life from his childhood. I don't know that, I'm guessing that, because of his enthusiasm and his vast knowledge of repertoire. Many times at social events, at the end of the evening, Bob and I will end up at the door singing songs that I didn't think anybody else knew but me. He loves music. It's a very important part of his life. He loves to sing, not the greatest singer in the world, but enthusiastic as can be. And I can't tell you, I have sung with a lot of people in this world, Beverly Sills, Joan Sutherland, but one of the greatest joys in my life is singing with Bob Atwood at the end of a party.
Okay.
Lorraine, we understand that Bob is a very willing and enthusiastic musician. Could you tell me about his legendary talents?
Well, I would say that Bob will readily admit he's no Pavarotti, but he does have enthusiasm for what he does, and that's just about as important as the voice. He was always willing to do anything that I would ask him to do. We had a male quartet. He was a very important part of that. He would call the other fellows and say, well, let's get together over at Lorene's tonight and practice some things for the Elks Club for a week from Saturday night. And he always had a little humor that went with it, too. There was no question about the humor that Bob put into his music as well. He was very outstanding as far as being in the male chorus. We had a male glee club, and we performed in the Empress Theater. That was the only place where we had at that time, other than the Elks Club. And we would usually perform in a weekday night because the manager of the theater at that time would charge us whatever they expected that the theater crowd would have brought in that particular night. So Wednesday night was usually a slow night as far as the theater was concerned, and we would have our concerts then. Then we also had a women's concert group, and the men and the women together would give programs at different times. And I just have to say that Bob was always available and in there whenever he was asked to participate. Is that